Good afternoon. I'm Rory Fitzgerald. I'm the Director of the European Social Survey at City University of London, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our afternoon seminar today to launch the Round 9 Topline Report on the Justice and Fairness in Europe module. So the European Social Survey is a biennial cross-national general social survey, and as part of our questionnaire process every 2 years, we have an open competition where teams of scholars from across Europe are invited to bid to populate part of the questionnaire alongside the rich demographic and socioeconomic information which we collect. And for the Round 9 module, Stefan, Liebig and his colleagues were successful, beating many other high-quality module applications. So back in 2016 to 2018, the successful team worked hard with colleagues in the European Social Survey core scientific team to develop the module which we're going to be basing today's presentations and top-line report on. That was a lot of hard work, and I'd like to thank Stefan and his colleagues for all of that work that went into producing such a high-quality module. The 2018 to 2019 module was fielded alongside the ESS core questionnaire in over 25 countries. And in fact, today's top-line report summarises the findings from the module from 27 nations in Europe, all conducted face-to-face, all using the highest quality methods that are feasible in a cross-national European context. Following today's presentations, you'll be sent a copy of the top-line report which has been produced. So today we have three presenters. Professor Guillermina Jasso, Professor of Sociology and Silver Professor of Arts and Science from New York University. She's written extensively on basic socio-behavioral theory, distributive justice, status, international migration, and inequality. We also have Professor Bernhard Kittel, Professor of Economics Sociology at the University of Vienna. He's also the principal investigator of the DFG research group, Need-Based Justice and Distributive Procedures. And he's currently also directing the Austrian Coronavirus Panel. And last, but of course by no means least, the head of the question module design team, Professor Stefan Liebig, director of the Socioeconomic Panel in Germany, and member of the DIW Berlin Executive Board, and also professor for Empirical Social Structure Analysis at the Free University of Berlin. His research focuses not only on the evaluation of social inequalities, but also on survey methodology. We'll now have a presentation, and following the presentation, ESS Deputy Director Eric Harrison will act as the discussant, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to pose questions. So please do use the question facility to pose questions, and we'll put those to the panel at the end of today's presentation. So I'll now hand over to the speakers for their presentation. So many thanks to them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rory, for this introduction, and thank you very much again for having the opportunity, having the opportunity in the last years to place this module in the European Social Survey and to collaborate with the perfect team of the European Social Survey in London. That was a great experience working together to improve this module, and we all, I think from our group, we learned a lot and are very thankful and grateful for the support we got from London. So today I'm very happy that we can present these top-line results from our module. And what means we? This is a group now in different countries and different cities, and I start with the team at DIW Berlin, Julia Adrian, Sandra Bohmann, Matteo Taga. They are still working on this module and the data. Julia Adrians was part of the team from the beginning. Thomas Hinz from University of Constance, he joined the group 1 year ago. Guillermina Jasso, she was part of the original team, and she is also here with us. Bernhard Kittel also, and Clara Sabach from University of Haifa. We produce, so to say, this top-line results, and all the credits go to us, so to say. The next slide, please. Matteo is in charge with changing the slides. Rory just mentioned some aspects of this module and this process. We proposed this module in 2015 or 16, long ago, and we had a long and very productive and positive process of questionnaire development with the ESS core scientific team. And as I already said, we learned a lot, and we were very grateful for the high professional support we got from the core scientific team. So thank you again to all in London. So the module was fielded in 2018-19 in 30 European countries. This is more or less the formal framework, but why did we thought that we should propose that module? The starting point of our module is that over the past few decades, European societies have witnessed increase in wealth and income inequalities. Faced with more flexible labor markets, open trade, skill bias, technological change, and so on, European welfare models have been unable to effectively address these rising inequalities. Although it is clear that challenges pertaining to inequality and the distribution of social resources will influence European society and policy making in both the short and the long run, it is much less clear how such challenges can or should be effectively addressed. One way to answer this question is by examining how people view and assess existing inequality, as well as the circumstances under which it is more or less justifiable. Inequalities are considered legitimate to the extent that, among other things, they either meet or violate citizens' normative expectations regarding the way in which valued resources should be distributed. These expectations differ not only within and between societies, but also over time. Given the present and future challenges faced by European societies, empirical grounded knowledge about the attitudes towards social justice is a prerequisite for choosing appropriate political and policy measures. With the ESS Round 9 module, we built up a Europe-wide database that provide not only insights into the fundamental questions of the legitimacy of existing inequalities in European societies, but also with an empirical basis for the scientific study of the societal and structural predicates and consequences of individual justice attitudes toward inequality. Why do we think that justice attitudes are important? Why do people strive for justice? Given its importance, how can the concept of justice help to explain other social phenomena? Although the answer to the question, what is justice, may vary individually and structurally, the motivation to live in a society perceived as just is very fundamental. The desire to be a part of social arrangements that are fair and just is a fundamental human motivation. It is linked to the idea that the world is manageable and predictable and is central to the human ability to engage in goal-directed activity at both the individual and societal level. As a result, justice judgments not only affect how people evaluate a specific law or policy, but also change their mirror connection to civic society and state institutions. That is, people are more likely not only to endorse policies that correspond to their normative expectations about justice, but also to become better and more committed citizens as a result. Studying justice attitudes by means of cross-national surveys relies on the assumption that justice is a social phenomenon that can be conceptualized as a social value in the sense of shared conceptions of the desirable. Justice refers to the normative conceptions of the allocation and distribution of resources and burdens in a social aggregate. Three formal criteria constitute a state of justice. First, equal treatment. Second, impartiality. And third, consideration of legitimate claims. How to achieve this state, that is, which norms can be used to guide behavior that will realize the value of justice, depends on the various conceptions of justice developed over time that have become a substantial part of human culture. The theoretical model underlying our module is based on the assumption that what is regarded as just is, in a substantial sense, varies with the basic structure of a society and the position of a person within a society. And that experiences of injustice or justice affect attitudes and behavior and thereby lead to social consequences that can affect the functioning of organizations, institutions, and society as a whole. And this is what this picture you see here is all about. There are some structural conditions within a society. They affect the justice attitudes, the justice experience of individuals. Individuals react on that, and their individual behavior has some social consequences. And this is the basic structure, the basic formal model that guides also our analysis with the data. Accordingly, two basic insights gained from past research serve as building blocks. First, justice is socially determined because whether something is regarded as just depends on the social structures and processes within a society or other social aggregates. Second, justice is a social force because it affects the economic, political, and social structures and processes within societies and other social aggregates. In that model, the individual position within a society and her experiences are crucial not only for what she regards as just, but also how she is reacting on perceived injustice. In studying the different aspects of justice attitudes, our module focuses on three dimensions. First, attitudes towards distributive justice. Second, on procedural justice. And third, a basic attitude of people, and some people are talking also from a psychological trait, the belief in a just world. But only the two dimensions are now part of this or subject of our presentation. So we will concentrate on the aspect of distributive justice, the attitudes on that, and the aspect of procedural justice. When we are talking about distributive justice, what kind of attitudes are interesting in that? First of all, the distribution and allocation of resources, of goods and bads in a society are following, in a way, some rules. And we, please, Matteo, please go back, stay here. Yeah, I want to go over the bullet points. Normative orientations means that people might differ in the rules they think that these rules should guide the distribution of goods and bads. That is the first element we are talking about, and the first aspect we will present some results from all over Europe. And the second aspect of distributive justice is not what kind of rules should guide our distributions, but what are the outcomes of these? The outcomes might be the most crucial aspect of distribution. And the third aspect we are talking about are chances. And we know from research that the preference of, or the chances for getting education, chances for getting a job are a very important aspect of justice and the justice feelings. And these are the three aspects we are talking about. And I will present results from the normative orientations. Billy Jasso will talk about the outcomes, and Bernhard Kittel will present the results on the procedural justice aspect. The next slide, please. We can ask what determines whether inequalities are considered fair or unfair. One factor is whether these distributional results or the results within a society run counter to or coincide with the normative ideas of how goods and burdens should be allocated within a society. Research shows that four basic distributive principles are important, so to say. We can analyze different views on the procedure, on the rules of justice, and what we can see is that four idle types are on the basis of our thinking about justice. These four basic distributive principles are, first of all, equality, equity, need, and entitlement. Equality means, and that is more or less clear, everyone should be given an equal share of goods and burdens. The need principle means that goods and burdens should be allocated in a way that ensures basic needs are covered. Equity is the idea that the distribution of goods and burdens should be based upon individual inputs. That is, the more someone contributes, the more that someone should receive. Finally, goods and burdens are distributed according to the principle of entitlement based on status, where both origins and past achievements play a role. The respondents of the European Social Survey were presented with these propositions, and what we find is what you see. We start with the equality principle, and you see the green areas show the agreement on this principle. Yellow means people are not clear if they approve that principle or not. And the third is the disagreement to this principle. And we ordered the countries from the European Social Survey according to the degree they are agreeing to the equality principle. And what you can see is that against the idea that justice means always equality, in the European countries, the agreement on an equal distribution of goods and burdens is not clear. There is no clear pattern that everybody wants to have an equal distribution of goods and burdens. Instead, we see that in the different countries, especially, for example, in Norway or in Sweden or in Netherlands, a majority is not agreeing on the equality as a guiding principle for distribution of societal reward, goods and burdens. In the contrary, if we go to the equity principle, here we see a pattern that seems to show that Europeans agree that rewarding individual inputs as an important principle guiding the allocation of goods and burdens in a fair society. So these are the first two principles, and we see on one hand a consensus in relation to the equity principle, and a pattern where in some countries there is high agreement to equality, and other countries where the agreement or the equality orientation is very low, for example in Norway. The other two distributive rules show also a very interesting pattern all over Europe. And what we see here with the need principle, that also here, compared as the case with the equity principle, there is a high percentage of agreement in the European countries, and that the variation over countries in agreement is compared to the equality principle is much lower. And the entitlement principle that resources should be distributed according to your status. Entitlement shows that the agreement is on a very, very low level compared to the other three. So what is the take-home message? Europeans seem to agree in considering it fair to reward effort and to guarantee basic needs. Allocating rewards based on status does not find much support. However, equality as a guiding principle for the just allocation of resources is met with support in some countries, but it is seen more critical in others. Thank you for that, and we switch over, and I hand over to Guillermina Jasso.
Thank you very, very much, Stefan. I want to begin by thanking the team in London, the European Social Survey team, for their extremely far-sighted vision in having these competitions for modules. I want to thank my fellow team members, those of us who submitted the module to the competition and who continued to work on this topic with these data which are massively rich. Now, I want to begin first by emphasizing, underscoring some of the things that my colleague Stefan Liebig said. So remaining on this slide that summarizes the take-home message one, among the things that Stefan said were two really important things, namely that the sense of justice is fundamental in the human experience. And secondly, that it is not only fundamental to individual persons, but that it is a social force. And so together, this gives us some glimpse into the dual persona of the sense of justice as it operates within persons, within countries, across societies in general. Now, within persons, there are two very important operations. Humans form ideas of justice. They form ideas about what is fair. And the principles that Stefan laid out for us, in particular, the principles of equality, equity, also called merit or desert, and need, are the classical principles handed down to us since Plato, who discussed all three of those principles. These are the principles that guide individuals as they form their ideas about what is fair. Entitlement is different. We see it empirically in societies, but it does not have this classical, this shall we say, this halo of a foundational principle of justice. And in fact, every time that I see a reference to entitlement or status as a basis for distribution, I am reminded of what St. Augustine wrote in The City of God, when he said, "Without justice, what are kingdoms but giant robberies?" All right, so besides forming ideas about what is fair, individuals assess the fairness or unfairness of the actual situations that they see around them. And that is going to be the main focus of my part of the presentation. But before leaving this slide, let me emphasize one final thing that Stefan said, and that has to do with how, although the sense of justice is universal, the specific content of the sense of justice varies across persons and also by elements of the social structure. And so there's a principle that we have about this. A famous psychologist named Elaine Hadfield and a famous economist named Milton Friedman, back in the 1970s, independently said the same thing. Justice is in the eye of the beholder. Obviously, one of the things this means is that this data set, which is massively rich, is going to be mined by researchers for many years and all around the world as it starts to yield its secrets about the way the sense of justice operates. Okay, so now let us transition to the next slide. And in this transition, we are going from individuals forming ideas about what is fair and the principles that guide those ideas. 2, the assessments of the justice or injustice of actual situations. So now look at this slide, evaluation of the 10th and 90th percentile incomes. That's actually a modest title for this crucially important slide. So I want to walk you through this slide a little bit. What this does is basically 2 things. Not only what the title tells us, and I'll come back to that, but it does something else very important. And to see that, let's see what the instruction says. This is the question that respondents across the ESS countries were asked. Please think about the top 10% of employees working full-time in your country, earning more than blank, the amount per month or per year in your country. Okay, let's stop there for a minute. What the ESS team did was provide to respondents the actual incomes in their countries at the 10th and 90th percentiles. This is a very, very important thing, and it's going to come back in a subsequent slide. But for now, let's just understand this. The 10th percentile represents the income that divides the bottom 10% from everyone else. And similarly, the 90th percentile represents the income that divides, it's the threshold between the top 10% and everyone else. And so these amounts are provided. And now the respondent is thinking about these are the top and bottom. You're only seeing the slide for the top 10%, but there's a companion question for the bottom 10% of employees working full time. And the instruction is very clear. This refers to gross income. And so now the interviewer says, we're going to ask you what you think, in your opinion, are these incomes, either at the bottom 10% or the top 10%, are they unfairly low, fair, or unfairly high? And so you see this justice scale here, with 0 representing the point of perfect justice, negative numbers representing unfair underpayment, and positive numbers representing unfair overpayment. So again, this is this very important slide that provides the 90th percentile and 10th percentile incomes, and that asks respondents to judge the fairness or unfairness of the earnings of the top 10% in this slide, and in the companion slide, the bottom 10%. Going now to the next slide, we see now the evaluations. And these are the results within each country, the proportions within each country that said the incomes are underpaid, those are the red bars. The proportion that said fairly paid, those are the green bars. And the proportion that said overpaid, those are the blue bars. So let's look first at the top half of the slide, bottom incomes. And the first thing that we see is that this is absolutely consistent with what we saw earlier when we examined the results for the principles of justice. The results are in line with the observed support for the merit and need principles across Europe. Bottom incomes are judged as unfairly low by the great majority of respondents in the ESS. The interpretation is that these incomes of the bottom 10% in each country are judged to violate the principles of merit and need. Remember, these are classical principles. We have Plato saying, when he first sets up this idea that in the beginning, everyone had an equal allotment, the equal lot. And then he says, this minimum lot should never be tampered with. It is inviolable. No one. And then Plato adds this nice characteristic touch. Anyone who seeks to keep his virtue should never violate this minimum lot at the bottom. And it seems to me that these data show this extremely clearly. Those red bars are overwhelming for the bottom incomes. But now look at the top incomes. This is a very different situation. Top incomes are more likely to be judged as fair compared to incomes at the bottom of the distribution. So while respondents across Europe seem to be saying those incomes of the bottom 10% are unfairly low, they are much less likely to say that the incomes of the top 10% are unfairly high. Instead, what we see in that bottom half of the slide is all of a sudden fairness, the green bars between the red and the blue. See how large some of those green bars are? There is less unease based on the sense of justice with high incomes than there is with low incomes. And of course, this remains a major line of discussion in philosophy and in social discourse. It's one of the famous contributions of the philosopher John Rawls. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. I think this is my favorite slide, and you're going to see in a minute why it is so important. The first thing is let's understand what is on the slide, and then we will discuss it. This shows separately for the top 10% and for the bottom 10%, it plots the average justice evaluation. Remember the scale going from -4 to +4, where 0 was perfect justice? So this plots for each country the average justice evaluation on this wonderful inequality measure, the ratio of the income at the 90th percentile to the income at the 10th percentile. So remember when I said that slide with the question on justice evaluation, that was doing another very, very important thing. It was providing the incomes at the 90th and 10th percentiles. Well, now we use them. And this measure, the 90 to 10 ratio, is a popular and appealing measure of inequality. It has wonderful properties, statistical properties. It satisfies principles of inequality measurement. So now with that as a background, now let's see. So that 90-10 measure represents the quantitative distance between rich and poor workers in a country, okay? Ratio of 90 to 10. Now, if you look closely at the slide, you see that most of the countries in Europe are clustered below a 90-to-10 ratio of about 7. The exceptions are Cyprus and the Slovak Republic. Footnote, I looked up the 90-to-10 ratio for gross incomes in the United States, and it hovers around 7. So you can think of the United States as having a 90-10 ratio that's a little bit higher than the highest one in the group excluding Cyprus and Slovak Republic, similar to Latvia, as you can see on this slide. Okay, so now we see two extraordinary patterns, and I'm going to begin with the bottom pattern, the one for the bottom 10%. As the actual inequality in the country increases, the sense of justice gets more and more to the unfair, underpaid side. And it's not trivially steep. Look at that line, look at that scatter. So what this is saying is completely consistent with what we saw earlier about the importance of the principle of need. Respondents, humans all over Europe, react negatively to very low incomes in the bottom 10%. But now let's look at the top half of the slide, top incomes. Actually, if we were to exclude one of the outliers, Cyprus, there would be almost no correlation, which is to say that the average justice evaluation for the incomes of the top 10% does not change much as the society's level of inequality increases, which is to say, as the top incomes, the top 10% of incomes increase. So this is an extremely important slide. And as it says as the bottom, the level of actual inequality exacerbates judgments of unfairness for bottom incomes, but not for high incomes. All right, continuing to the next slide, this summarizes what we just saw. Inequality at the bottom of the distribution. This means what inequality is doing at the bottom of the distribution, namely lower incomes, elicits stronger feelings of injustice compared to what inequality does at the top of the distribution, which is to increase the incomes at the top. This judgment of unfair low incomes is more pronounced, more intense in high inequality settings. So it seems to me, a powerful message, and one that I predict researchers will be studying with great care in each of the ESS countries. Continuing now, we're going to switch gears. When people form ideas of justice, they form them not only for others, they form them for themselves as well. And when people judge the fairness or unfairness of actual situations, they make these assessments not only about others, but also about self. And so this slide now presents one of the basic questions that is asked in the module about evaluation of own earnings. So anyone who worked for pay was asked if the gross pay they reported for themselves is unfairly low or fair, or unfairly high. And you see the basic slide, the basic justice scale again. Fair pay, coded 0, underpayment with negative numbers, and then overpayment with positive numbers. So now let's go to the next slide and see the results. As before, judgments of underpayment are in red, judgments of fair payment are in green, and judgments of overpayment are in blue. So what do we see here? Great heterogeneity in these assessments of fairness of own earnings between European countries. There seems to be a geographical divide. It's possible in broad brush to identify 3 clusters of countries. Countries in Eastern Europe, Mediterranean countries, and countries in North and Central Europe. Now there's something else in this slide that is very interesting. Look at how tiny the blue bars are. Most people in most countries appear to judge their own earnings as either unfairly low or fair. And they display a reluctance, perhaps an unease, with judging their own earnings as unfairly high. In fact, if you look closely at those blue bars, it looks like none of them exceeds 10%. Now, again, this is something that is going to be studied and studied and studied. It's an important phenomenon in the study of fairness. I very quickly went back and looked at the International Social Justice Project of 1991 and 1992, which asked very similar questions. There is an overlap of about 10 countries, and I'm fudging that a bit because country definitions have changed, but it's an overlap of about 10 countries, which means that it will be possible to compare within those countries the sense of justice in 1991 and now. But what I will tell you for now is that in that project in 1991, no country had more than 5% saying that their own earnings were unfairly high. So this is something, as I said, to study and study and study some more. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Bernhard Kittel. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Hello. Let me continue with a few reflections on the procedural or aspects of procedural justice. But before that, let me also thank you, the ESS and the team, for making all this possible. What you see on this slide is 2 questions that relate to educational and job chances. We have used both reflexive and non-reflexive statements. What you see on the slide is the non-reflexive statement, which looks at the general assessment whether the chances of achieving the level of education is fair and the chances of getting a job is fair. Let me read out the question formulation for the reflexive statements. And they say, with respect to education, compared to other people in your country, in country X, I have had a fair chance of achieving the level of education I was seeking. And the question about the fairness of job opportunities is framed in a hypothetical way. It states, imagine you were looking for a job today. To what extent do you think the statement would apply to you? And the statement is, compared to other people in country X, I would have had a fair chance of getting the job I was seeking. Now, assessing both the reflexive and the non-reflexive formulation allows us to compare the general assessment to the evaluation of the own position, which in turn allows you to study, for example, the effect of socioeconomic status on fairness evaluations. Now let us continue to the next slide. And on this slide, you see, as with previous slides of this sort, two messages. We have own and educational and job chances, with the scale of that on the horizontal axis and the countries on the vertical axis. The countries are sorted by educational chances. And you can see that the range is somewhere between 8.5 for the best, or most, or of the fairest views, and it goes down to 5.5. And similar to the evaluation of fairness of income, we can also identify some country patterns with a few exceptions, which will be very interesting to study in future case studies. But on top, in terms of procedural fairness with respect to educational chances, are countries in the northwest and center of Europe. In the middle, we have countries more to the east and the south, and in the top, in the bottom of the graph, the same. Now, if you now turn to the red lines, this pattern becomes much more blurred. So own job chances don't seem to fit such a strong correlation with geographical patterns, which in turn stand for cultural patterns across Europe. Let us proceed to the next slide. Here on this slide, we see the relationship between the evaluation of the own educational on the top panel and job chances on the bottom panel, and related to the evaluation of the fairness of own gross income. Now, what you see immediately is that there is a very clear positive correlation between the two, which seems to be considerably stronger for the job chances than for the educational chances. At this point, I should briefly mention why did we choose these two dimensions. So educational chances and occupational chances. Well, these are in a modern society the most prominent factors determining income afterwards. And indeed, this is what we find. Education with an R-square of about 0.35 is slightly less, gives a slightly less clear pattern than the job chances, which is quite natural. Education gives the basic fundament of any income chances. In the end, it's the job that determines income. So as we have seen in previous slides, there is a high degree of congruency between the different dimensions that we are studying in this module. Let us continue to the next slide. So what did we learn from these considerations? On earnings, educational and job chances are quite heterogeneously evaluated across Europe. However, in particular, with respect to earnings and job chances, we find a north, west, south, east divide that seems to be characterizing patterns of justice evaluations across Europe. And we also find that if educational and job opportunities are positively evaluated, people seem to be more likely to also evaluate their income as fair, even if their income is low. This points to a very important aspect of fairness evaluations, namely procedural fairness in a wider sense. Procedures that allow people to participate and take part in collective decisions. And if the process is evaluated as fair, people are more likely to believe that other aspects of their life are based on fair procedures. In order to examine procedural justice, we rely on a categorization that has been developed quite some years ago in the 1990s by Daniels and Sabin. They proposed 4 aspects that are relevant conditions for assessing a procedure as a fair procedure. The first is public accessibility, both of process itself and information about the process. So transparency is an important aspect here. Second, the principles underlying a procedure must be debatable and must be considered as reasonable from the perspective of those involved. Third, there must be a mechanism for challenging a procedure and for disputing it, but there must also be a possibility to resolve disputes and an opportunity to revise decisions in case they turn out not to be as adequate as initially thought. And the fourth condition is that there must be some regulation of the process itself that ensures that the first 3 conditions just mentioned are actually met. So this idea is underlying the conceptualization of the module with respect to procedural justice. And here are the first 3 questions. They ask about fairness and participation. They ask about impartiality by asking whether people think that interests of citizens are taken into account. They refer to transparency, that everyone can see how decisions were made. These 3 questions are specific to the module. The 4th dimension, Matteo, could you please, yes, is one that is part of the core questionnaire. It asks, how much would you say that the political system allows people like you to have a say in what the government does? And let us continue to the next slide. And then a very general question about the possibility to raise your voice, how much, which is also one of the core questionnaire, so we make use of these. How much would you say that the political system allows people like you to have an influence on politics? But taking these together, let us now look at some results on the next slide. This summarizes the assessment of procedural justice. We produced an index of procedural justice, the details of which you can read in the top-line results. And what we observe here is that on the 5-point scale, European countries actually don't do as good as one might hope. The winner in terms of fairness of procedures is Switzerland, which fits well with their participatory political culture. This is kind of expected, but still a 3.2 on a 5-point scale is not impressive. So overall, it seems as if Europe has some air to improve procedures in order to allow people to assess justice, the justice of procedures in a better way. Having said this, let us go into some more details. The higher values are in darker colors, and what you can see fits again with what you have seen throughout this webinar, that there is some sort of north-northwest, south-southeast pattern ranging from higher evaluations on average to lower, with pretty low assessments in countries in Croatia, in Italy, and Bulgaria. So summarizing these findings on the next slide. So general, rather low scores, and a clear north-south divide. Now let me add perhaps an afterthought on these findings. This north-west, south-east pattern with respect to procedural justice might be related to the specific relationship between state and society. We have countries in Europe which have some sort of citizen culture. So the political system is considered as the collectivity of citizens and serves the citizens. But the citizenship idea is very strong in these countries. These are in particular the Nordic countries, but also you can find this culture in the Netherlands in a quite pronounced way. Then there are countries which have a public service culture. So where the idea of the state services its citizens is very strong. So the state is not, like in Muslim countries, considered as based in the society, but it is an organization serving society. And then the third pattern is more in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. It is a pattern where state and society are juxtaposed, or very often the idea is the state is above society, and there's a confrontational relationship between the two, which certainly relates back to absolutist governance in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. But this is something that should certainly be studied in more detail. But it seems to go beyond a mere welfare state approach to distributional justice, more an approach that focuses on the way a country is administered. So, do we have another slide? Conclusions. And actually, this is something I believe that Stefan, as the leader, should do, but he has turned off his microphone. So I will start, and perhaps he could finish with a few final words. So in Europe, something that Kenneth Boulding has stated in the early 60s, it goes something like, society is just if all can sup on the table or have a soup on the table, and then there's a high table where the deserving get their nice meal. And this seems to be underlying the strong emphasis on equity on the one hand and need on the other hand as important principles. So there's some fundament, everybody should be able to survive, but then there's a clear merit-based idea underlying justice evaluations. With respect to equality, we don't find such a clear pattern. And now I see Stefan, and if you would like to take over.
I think we are running out of time, I guess. So, I mean, these are the basic results we just reported. And I would thank everybody, Bernhard and Gilly, for presenting them, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the three presenters, for a fascinating presentation, and also very, very clear one. So thank you very much for that. Please start to pose your questions in the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom meeting. And whilst you're posing your questions, and there's a few coming in already, we'll ask our discussant, Dr. Eric Harrison from City University of London, to give some reflections, and also to thank Eric as well, because of course he was very involved in the development of the module at City. And perhaps whilst Eric's speaking, perhaps we could stop sharing the slides. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Rory. I trust everybody hears me well. Please. Yeah, okay, so that's good. So thank you very much indeed, both for the presentation and for all the work you did during the development of the module. Thank you also for a very attractive top lines booklet, which I'm sure people will be looking forward to getting their hands on some of those nice graphs. So I'd like to use my privileged position here to just make 5 quick observations. They're not comprehensive, but they are things that particularly struck me during the presentation. So number 1 is this striking finding, really. There is a great deal more agreement about the importance of the equity principle than there is sort of straight equality. And this is notable. What really struck me is that this is true even in Norway and Sweden. So it sort of made me think a couple of times about my definition of the term sort of egalitarian. So that's a very interesting thing. And this idea about that that people should be allowed to sort of get out what they put in, sort of effort-based model, and this was very much reflected, wasn't it, in the evaluations of high pay. So respondents were sort of an outcome-based logic if you were being paid highly, you'd probably, you probably deserved it because you'd probably put a lot of effort in. And there's maybe a little bit of unpicking and unpacking to do there. So that was the first striking thing. The second thing, which is sort of addressed to data users and analysts like myself, is that I was very struck by the capacity there is within the data series that is the ESS to make use of some of these attitudes in relation with the rotating modules on attitudes to the welfare state. Because obviously sort of attitudes to welfare policies are sort of specific instances of a general value or attitude. Now obviously they're not in the same rounds, but there is still clearly work that can be done with pooled data and to think about age groups and other splits in the data. So that was again something that interested me as a user. The third thing I was very interested by is the graphs that show that the actual patterns of inequality, the macro data, the contextual data, are very much a driver of attitudes. And one of the things that is intriguing, of course, for me is how this might work. Now, of course, one of the things, as was set out very clearly for us, was the way that we tried to be helpful to respondents by filling in the numbers for their 10th and 90th percentiles. And we talked long and hard about this kind of, about doing this kind of exercise. And obviously what we gained in clarity in communicating with the respondents was the ability to access and control for whether they would have actually had any idea that these were the correct figures. So in other words, we actually supplied people's knowledge of the income distribution in order to get a much more accurate measure of what it was we wanted. But of course, it seems to me that one of the intervening variables between the actual inequality in a country and how people feel about it is whether they actually, how much they actually know that that is the case. And so obviously in all future work and in parallel work, there's obviously all kinds of opportunities to explore that kind of thing. So I'm on to number 4, staying on drivers. We know from some of the work on well-being that one of the drivers of how positive people feel about the overall quality of their society, one of those drivers is how happy they are with their own lives, how satisfied they are with their own lot. And again, this is a very interesting. This is something that can be done with the data, and be interesting to see what the models look like, where you've got satisfaction or fair, people feeling that their own earnings are fair, with how they then feel about those of others and of the society as a whole. So that's sort of parallel with the well-being literature. Just something I forgot to say on number 1, but I can't let the opportunity to use the quote go. It was very noticeable, wasn't it, that people are much more preoccupied by the bottom of the distribution than the top. So this was in relation to both the fairness of pay at the bottom, and also in the emphasis upon need, which one would assume is usually focused towards the lower end of the societal distribution. And it reminded me of a quote from a British politician in 1998 who said he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. And that's more than 20 years ago now, and that was from a governing party on the social democratic end of the spectrum. But I think it's a very interesting sort of summation of maybe the way a lot of people think. And finally, a little bit more of a forward-looking observation. I was struck over and over and over again during this presentation about how salient the content of this module is and has been over the last 6 months. So I can only speak for life in the UK, but issues about who shares the burden, do people do their fair share, what is fair in terms of things like restrictions on freedom, what is fair in terms of who takes the economic burdens that come from living through this kind of crisis. And it made me think very much that, of course, a lot of the way that certainly this most recent round of COVID is being experienced in the UK is it's highly differentiated now. That it was very largely a national experience, but now we're more acutely aware of the differential effects on regions, age groups, people with different health statuses, people with different household types, family structures. And so, of course, you know, this sort of sense of share out and the perceptions of fairness is as salient now as it was in 2018-19. And I very much hope that we'll get another viewing of this module within the ESS at some point in the future, because I can't help thinking that as COVID-19 situation evolves, the next round of stories, the next round of COVID stories, will be increasingly less about health stories, and they will be about economic and social justice. So thank you very much again to everyone in the team for all your work and a very enjoyable presentation.
Thank you, Eric. Perhaps we could ask the team if they've got any responses to the 5 points that Eric made, and then after that we'll move to some questions from the audience.
Perhaps I may start. These results for the equality principle in the Nordic countries is also something which is very strange in the first hand, because I also expected that the preference for equality is much higher in the Nordic countries than in the other countries. So and maybe it is a reaction on the equality which is in these countries. Yeah, and I mean, we know that Sweden, for example, has had a change also in their structures, and is getting more. For example, when we look at the population, it's getting more heterogeneous. So maybe this is one aspect of reacting on structural changes within the society. And our picture from Sweden is there's a high homogeneous society, religiously related to the religion, 90% Protestants, and so on. This is the story of the last 100 or 200 years, and also in with regard to the ethnic composition, it's a very homogeneous society, or it has been a very homogeneous society, and so maybe these high approval of equity is exactly the reaction of these structural changes. But I mean, this is I guess this is a guess, and we should exactly go into these details more. And I mean, we need longitudinal data, but this is one point, yeah, for me, one explanation. But Bernhard will also comment on that.
I would like to add on what you said. Stefan, you have just emphasized the structural conditions, which indeed became much more heterogeneous. And we know that equality is a principle that people use in homogeneous situations, or situations where there is no reason to differentiate. And but if we look back from an exchange theoretic perspective, it is the equity principle that has been highlighted as the core principle of managing social relationships. And so to put it from a different perspective, we can also say equality actually is equity under the condition that there is no reason to differentiate. And this is what people seem to do. But apart from these, this increasing heterogeneity of societies, I would also like to emphasize the merit aspect. If there's a reason to differentiate between contributions to society, for example, or contributions to economic well-being of the whole society, then Europeans seem to be very willing to give more to those who contribute more. And the northern countries, with their high taxes and a lot of redistribution, may have redistributed more than the populations were willing to accept, and then heterogeneity started to become more pronounced. And this might be an observation for the development over time and the reason why we have this result now. But this is just amending Stefan Liebig's point.
Maybe I have two other points to Eric, more or less comments. I mean, the third, your third point, that we provide them with real numbers when we ask for 10th and 9th evaluation. I mean, we know that people underestimate the inequality. And I mean, maybe but I mean, this is what we should test, so to say. There is some research on that, how people change their evaluations, also justice evaluations, if they get more information. And it shows that they really underestimate the degree of inequality and react on that. If they get information, then they react also on that. So, and maybe the next time we should have a experimental design, providing respondents, one half providing with information, the other half not. So the fourth point, your question, what is the driver? I mean, one of the ideas behind that module is also to be able to test the relative importance of reflexive and non-reflexive justice attitudes. Meaning, yeah, what is more important for my own life, satisfaction with my own life, or my political engagement, and so on and so on. And I mean, what we are now able to have two parallel, or we have now two parallel measurements, how people evaluate their own income and how they evaluate the 10th and the 9th, so the other. And I mean, the easiest way would be to have on the left side of the equation satisfaction with life, and on the right side these two measures, and just check which is more important. And I mean, you can do that for everything what you want, yeah. And I think this is to me, this is the most important aspect with this, or topic, or feature of this data, so to say, that we can address exactly this question, which is also part of some economic theories about justice. They also talk about other regarding preferences and all these things. And the data here allows us to really test this with a parallel measurements. And this is one of the good thing we have now at hand, and one of the, to me, the best outcome of this engagement, so to say. And we can do that in comparative testing the models over different countries. And it may be that in some countries, non-reflexive evaluations are more important for the individual than in other countries. And we can think about the relation of these two aspects, reflexive and non-reflexive. Okay, these are two ideas.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to Eric for his comments and thoughts. Let's move to some questions from
Bernhard wants to add something.
Okay.
I just wanted to respond to the question about COVID-19, and actually this is part of what I'm currently doing. I initiated the Austrian Corona Panel project in March. We have been in the field since end of March with weekly waves for the first 10 weeks, and from then onwards monthly waves, and we will be in the field for another year, having funding now from the Austrian Science Fund. We tried to get Horizon 2020 money, but we were among the 160 applications that were unsuccessful. But we will certainly be interested in adding something in ESS in the future, perhaps a very small module. But this is certainly an important topic.
Thank you, Bernhard. Okay, some questions from members of the audience. First was, is one reason why more people in Eastern Europe judge their income as unfairly low, be that they're not only comparing their income to their own country, but also to the income from other richer countries? Do you agree that that's a possibility, or is there any evidence for that? And then the second question was, since high incomes were seen as fair, but low incomes were seen as sort of very unfair, might it be that you were really measuring attitudes to poverty rather than inequality?
Rory, could we do one question after the other?
One at a time? Okay, let's focus first on the Eastern European one then. Is the reason why more people in Eastern Europe judge their incomes as unfairly low, be that they're not only comparing to people in their own country, but also to other richer countries?
Well, I have my micro on, so I will start, and perhaps Stefan, you can continue, or Willy perhaps. Living in Vienna, I experienced the exchange between high-income country and low-income countries within the European Union on a daily basis. And there's a point in there. People in the countries neighboring Austria know about the income levels in the country. This certainly spreads in the population. Probably best would be if we had a regional identifier which is sufficiently precise that we could check whether there's a difference between people, say, in Slovakia, Czechia, or Hungary who are living on the Austrian border and perhaps are commuting to work in Austria, and those who are living farther away. But it is certain that the information is there, and that information will be used to judge your own income. That's certainly a very reasonable hypothesis. I mean, I know people who commute 3 hours one way, so 6 hours per day in a car just to work.
Wow. Okay, thank you. The next question was, since high incomes were judged as sort of relatively fair, but the lower incomes as extremely sort of unfair, is there a possibility that what was really being measured was attitudes to poverty rather than inequality?
Billy, do you have an idea on that? Billy?
Stefan, if we can make sure that her phone is connected.
Okay, Vivi?
Okay, yeah, let me jump in here. That's a wonderful question. Is the assessment of inequality or is it an assessment of poverty? It's a very, very good question. When we focus on the bottom 10%, that definitely is highlighting, as the questioner said, poverty. Now, there are ways that researchers will be able to assess that in the data. There are micro models which enable distinguishing between injustice due to inequality and injustice due to poverty. So stay tuned. There will be a lot of that to come. But for now, you are exactly correct. If by bottom incomes we mean the bottom 10%, then of course this is the image that comes to mind is of poverty.
Thank you. And sort of following on from that, a question about whether or not you've yet looked at the respondent's own household income and its relationship to the results. Is that something that you've looked at so far, or is that to come later?
All that is going to come later. These are just the very initial aggregated findings. What will come later, and by the way, it won't be only from us. These data are massively rich. There will be researchers all over the world using these data with highly sophisticated models and highly sophisticated statistical procedures, and all the potentially relevant variables will be included in those models.
Fantastic. Okay.
Let me perhaps add, together with Sandra Bowman, I had an initial look into that variable and its effects, and it seems to be quite a strong predictor. So definitely, this is an important variable.
Thank you. The next question was from someone who'd like to ask what the proportion of missing data was in the questions regarding the measures of pay and fairness of pay across countries. And specifically, were there countries with larger gaps measured by the ratio 10 to 90, perhaps those with higher missingness?
Juve and Matteo, would you like to answer that?
Yes, I hope that everyone can hear me. My name is Julia. Hi, perfect. And I also worked on the report and the questionnaire design. And with regard to that question, we did, of course, check for missing values and whether we had any patterns there. The pattern that we see is that there are higher shares of missing values for the top income question. So we can think long and hard about what that means for our analysis, but my initial reaction to it would be, or interpretation would be, that maybe like we see in the responses, there's a much more a variation in responses. It's simply the harder question, so to speak. People may not have such a very clear attitude towards what's happening at the top as they have to the bottom, where if everyone sort of agrees that this is highly unfair, this might be one reason why we have lower missing data. And as far as I know, and as far as I have checked, there is no relationship between the actual level of inequality and the share of missings at the country level. Certainly the question of missing data is always relevant, But in this case, I don't think we are suffering from any major problems in terms of higher inequality relating to a higher share of missings.
Thank you. And another question, how should the bipolar justice evaluation scale be most appropriately applied in multivariate analysis, as probably a curvilinear effect is to be expected?
Well, perhaps let me give a first try, because I don't see the reason, or not immediately, why you expect a curvilinear effect here, because this is a distribution of responses, and the basic idea would be that there will be some people around the middle, and then it might look like a normal curve to the outside. So not sure whether curvilinearity is there by default. Because curvilinearity is a characteristic of a relationship, not of a single variable. So this will be something to explore and to develop hypotheses on in the course of specifying the model. And I would, in that case, simply use a quadratic term.
Yes, maybe.
If I may jump in here, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add here. Of course, it depends on what you're looking at, and if you think in terms of justice responses, I kind of go with or agree with the idea that there might be a curvilinear relationship, as justice theory assumes that over reward is a phenomenon of injustice. So if you think about what kind of consequences you are looking at, it might be based from a theoretical point of view very much important to think of consequences that are also on the positive side of the scale. I think it's a question of what you're actually trying to look at, like Bernhard said, and then using a quadratic term will be relevant. But I'm sure Willie has something to add on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Willie?
Thank you very much. But actually, both of you said exactly the correct thing, which is that it depends on the precise model that is being formulated and then estimated. And so you're going to, as you specify the model, you're going to be deciding whether you expect an effect to be monotonic or non-monotonic. As Yul said, if you expect a non-monotonic effect, then you think hard about how to represent that. Quadratic terms being one of the wonderful tools that we have. But this is model by model, and this is what researchers love to do and do very, very well. So I expect very interesting work to come.
Thank you. And just one more question from my side at the moment. Do you think there are some initial sort of policy relevant findings that stem from some of the data you've seen so far?
I mean, one point I think is very important, one finding, that the need principle is, to my view, the most important, or a very strong driver, or the question, what is the situation at the bottom? I think this is very important to have in mind, that this may cause much stronger effects in the population. And the other point is that, I mean, what we see is that people are very easy, or in some countries, or in most of the countries, very easy with respect to the high income situation. But they are much stronger affected by the situation at the bottom. And this is, I think, an important result, which might be important also for cohesion. Yeah.
Perhaps some of the discussions around efforts to try and alleviate the worst situation, either through welfare, through greater opportunity, or perhaps through schemes like basic income guarantee, of course, are becoming more prevalent in discussion. Lovely. Well, we're coming towards the end of the seminar today. Are there any final points that the panel would like to make? Perhaps I'll ask each of you for a closing remark before we close the workshop. Perhaps we could start with Bernhard.
Well, perhaps following up on what Stefan just said, something that we might learn from what we have done up to now and the analysis we have done is that needs and merit are the two core drivers of evaluations, and that policymakers are kind of asked by this result to look or to use that as a principle for policymaking. Equality seems to be less an issue at the moment. The issue is make sure that people survive, and then let people have an opportunity to earn. However, we haven't. It was not included in this ESS. I think it was in 7 or 8 question about basic income. Linking this to basic income is something. Well, I see some sort of a paradox here. On the one hand, people are very much in favor of catering to needs. On the other hand, they are against, to a majority, against a basic income idea. And what seems to be playing here is the problem of reciprocity. People who are in need should, according to the majority opinion, engage in overcoming their need. And this is something that is not considered in basic income concepts. And so if we add that idea, we may be on a route to solve that seeming paradox so far.
Absolutely. Do we have any other final comments from members of the panel? Please.
Yes, I do. I was very struck by Eric's wonderful observations, and of course my own team. But what Bernhard said about procedural justice was very striking. So, combining that with now the question about policy, let me try something that's not big policy, but just little things. Remember the questions about transparency, about knowing what's going on? Let's combine that with the insight that Eric discussed about how people don't often know what the actual inequality is. So it seems to me the obvious thing for a well-run statistical bureau in a country to do is to make this information widely available. So for example, in the United States, you can easily, like I did last night when I was preparing for this, I wanted to learn the 90th percentile for gross income and the 10th percentile for gross income, and I found them immediately, okay? that should be the case everywhere. Moreover, there are calculators on the web where you put in what you earn, and what you get in return is your percentile rank, and then you can do it by age, by region, by other things. All right? It seems to me that providing information, reliable information, is one of the chief duties of governments. And so that's a good place to begin. All these other ideas will follow. Basic income being a very important one. The equal additions principle of distributing windfalls in equal shares to all, so that everyone, at that point, equality becomes very important and reduces naturally inequality. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And
maybe
Stefan,
I can add one point. I completely agree with Willy, as always. But I think it is not only the task of the state or of the government. I think we as scientists do also have the responsibility to provide this information. And I think maybe it's better than when we provide this information. For example, the ESS has a tool, develops a tool where I put on the website, I put my monthly income in it, and I get in response my relative position in Europe or Germany or whatever. Or for example, the socioeconomic panel. We are presently working on such ideas that we get more, are able to get our information, which we have, more to the public, and based on the data we have. And I think this is a responsibility we also have, to inform people outside, so to say, what are the real numbers related to inequality.
I completely agree. The reason I highlighted governments is that I was responding to a question about policy. Yeah. But of course, research organizations and researchers, this is our duty, disseminate what we find. Absolutely correct.
And on a lower level, so to say, you don't have to have a PhD to understand these data.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have to provide them in a very simple manner, so that everybody can understand what's going on. And I mean, we have the tools. Yeah, we have the data, we have the technology to provide these informations.
Absolutely. So we look forward to seeing many more results emerging from this module, not only of course from your own analysis, but also that from other scholars. And a reminder to everyone in the webinar today that you can download all of this data that's been discussed today from our website, europeansocialsurvey.org. It's all available for free. So we're looking forward to seeing more and more results coming from the module and having opportunities to discuss it with you in future. So thank you to all of our panelists today for a really wonderful presentation and discussion. Everyone will receive the top line findings today. So thank you all very much, and wishing everyone a lovely rest of the day.